To continue our story of the Anti-Masonic Party, it's worth noting that technically it began with the Masons themselves, or at least those who called themselves Freemasons at one time or another, having taken degrees and associated themselves within the institution. Here in Part 3, we will learn about the earliest, most influential characters of the Anti-Masonic Party, the creation of the Lewiston Committee, and stick around until the end for new information on Morgan's whereabouts. Most likely, you've seen Parts 1 and 2 of why was the third earliest party in the United States opposed to Freemasonry? And if not, you should do that now and come back here later. Look for the links at the top of this page or in the description box below. If you're still here, welcome back to my channel, where I question history as we know it. I hope you enjoy the show, and if you do, you know what to do. And now, allow me to introduce you to two of the earliest, most influential characters in the anti-Masonic community, John Stearns and David Bernard, who were both former Masons themselves and Baptist ministers. John Stearns, the most quoted but least well known of the religious anti-Masons in New York, had actually renounced Masonry in July of 1826, before Morgan's disappearance. In September of 1826, he had published his views in a book entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Tendency of Speculative Masonry. In it, Stern relays that he was introduced to Freemasonry before becoming a minister, with the desire to learn the secrets it kept and be among the so-called honorable men, while also benefiting his business. He paid his dues and took the first 3 degrees at the Champion Lodge No. 146. Stern recalls that these degrees were not at all what he had expected, but he was determined to make the best of it, and so he dedicated himself to learning many of the lectures and obligations by heart. When a Christian Reformation took place in his town, he suddenly had a change of heart. He states that as he began to really look at the oaths he had sworn, he realized it was no place for a Christian and stopped attending lodge meetings. However, he continued to investigate the institution and began to put what he was learning down on paper. Soon, it was enough information for a book, and shortly after he had it published. Not having any knowledge of William Morgan or his writings, he didn't think much would come of his book, and only had 1,000 copies printed, assuming he would struggle selling those. But it was not long after it was published that the excitement of Morgan's disappearance took place, and a short while later, Morgan's book was published. As the movement progressed, Stern's book became regarded as a sequel to Morgan's book in the anti-Masonic community, and later editions would be augmented to include the events concerning Morgan's disappearance. Stearns argued in his book that Masonry is a religious institution, and that though it claims to be fundamentally based in the same principles of Christianity, he concludes that Freemasonry's values ultimately do not align with Christian values, and that a man would have to choose his loyalty to one over the other, based on a number of factors. He reminds us that the degrees are taken as oaths sworn with no previous knowledge of what you are swearing to, why you are swearing it, or the consequences suffered if one should break the oath. By swearing these oaths, one is forfeiting his life, being the property of the fraternity and bound to its will and no other. Under the threat of violence, one is sworn to secrecy and the obligation to come to the aid of a brother Mason regardless of the situation and whether the man be right or wrong. In William Preston Vaughan's book, The Anti-Masonic Party, he says that, quote, Stearns tried to prove that Masonry was a fraudulent substitute institution that attempted to compete with Christianity. He led the way in expounding the theory that Masonry was a state within a state, and that one day Masons would overthrow the democratic government of the United States and would crown one of their grand kings as ruler of this nation. He also tried to forge a connection between the principles of certain Masonic degrees with the Illuminati and the French Revolution. End quote. Of course, I would love to dive deep into all of that. But, per the usual, that's a story for another time. In the meantime, I would love to know what you think. Leave me a comment to let me know. Back to our current story. Then we have David Bernard. David Bernard became the first Mason to publicly renounce his membership after the Morgan disappearance. He was reportedly a minister who, for 30 years, ministered at one time or another in 15 different rural churches. He had served as a secretary of the First Leroy meeting and was appointed to a committee who agreed to publish the advanced degrees of Masonry. He would eventually succeed in his endeavors, and later in 1829, he would publish Light on Masonry, which even John Quincy Adams would later state his appreciation for having read. It was regarded as the Anti-Masonic Bible and continued to be printed until 1860. In this highly regarded book, Bernard explains that soon after beginning his work as a minister, Freemasonry was introduced to him as a, quote, twin sister of Christianity, having the support of other ministers and preachers as well. And so, he willingly took the first 3 degrees, but was silently disappointed by what occurred, and for 3 years he withdrew himself from the lodge, not speaking of himself as a Mason at all. Even though he thought the oaths he had taken were, in his words, frivolous and wicked, he couldn't seem to bring himself to believe that the whole institution itself was without benefit. This feeling was reinforced by members of higher degrees who assured him that what he had taken was not the most significant, but that the best was yet to come. So, he advanced into higher degrees, but his uncertainty continued to grow. While swearing an oath to become a Royal Archmason, Bernard asserts that he objected to the part where he must, quote, deliver a companion, right or wrong. The others assured him that it would make sense in the end, and proceeded. But Bernard says that the promised full explanation never came. When he talked to a fellow member about his concerns, the man solemnly reminded him that the first 7 degrees were founded on the Old Testament, and if he wished to, quote, arrive at perfection, he must proceed through the degrees which were beyond ordinary understanding. Between the reassurances and the penalties associated with taking the oaths, he continued forward and entered, quote, the Lodge of Perfection. Bernard writes that around 5 weeks before Morgan's abduction, a fellow minister and Royal Archmason informed him that William Morgan was writing a book on Freemasonry. His friend expressed his contempt of the fact and said that something should be done about it, after declaring that he would be among those who would, quote, put him out of the way, and that God looks upon the institution so highly he would never allow those who were involved to be found out. He also mentions that there had already been 2 meetings held about it and assumed that there would be another that day. Bernard states that he should have warned Morgan, but at the time he was under the impression that Morgan was already aware of the danger he was in. He goes on to state that he left home for several weeks after this conversation on account of his health, and that upon his return on September 16th, he learned that Morgan had been kidnapped and most likely murdered. He claims he spoke with Masons about this, and they justified both the abduction and the murder. It was at this point Bernard had read Elder John Stern's book and other writings about Masonry with interest. Comparing this information, weighing the alleged murder and the response from fellow members, he concluded that he could no longer stand by the fraternity's principles, and spoke his opinions about this openly. According to Bernard, this excited the Masonic community, and that a lodge meeting was called to establish an agreement about the matter. When lodge began, David claims that he stood up and announced his disapproval of what he had seen and heard thus far, apparently even bringing John Stern's book up in the process. He says for this he was particularly admonished or shamed, and that Morgan's murder was completely justified, one member announcing that just as cities and churches have their laws and enforce them, so too Masonry has their laws and has the right to enforce them. Bernard writes that another meeting is called later, which he attended at the request of the master. Here, he claims that after questioning him for several hours, the members harassed him, insulting and accusing him for speaking out against Freemasonry. After a time, he requested permission to leave and was thereafter expelled from the lodge. He asserts that the members then attempted to ruin his character by speaking badly of him to others, affecting his business, personal life, and peace of mind to the point which he concluded the only way forward was the destruction of the institution itself. He felt a way to accomplish this would be to, quote, make a full disclosure of its secrets. Since the trial of Chesborough, Lawson, Sawyer, and Sheldon had produced such light sentencing and no further information, Bernard spoke with like-minded individuals living in Batavia and Leroy and helped form an assembly of Masons opposed to the fraternity, and a meeting was called on February 19, 1827, to discuss the matter. Bernard says that there were 40 in attendance, though other accounts state 10 to 12, with most of them being expelled Masons for, quote, un-Masonic conduct. That was a new word for me. Is it in the dictionary? No. But the Masons know what it means, and now we know it means inconsistent with the values, objectives, and principles of Freemasonry. At the meeting, it was agreed that Morgan had been murdered, and that the institution would commit all kinds of crimes if it was permitted to continue. They resolved that they must reveal to the public Masonry's secrets. It was confirmed that Illustrations of Masonry by William Morgan was correct, and it was resolved that a genuine exposition of the higher degrees should be publicized. Committees were formed to prepare all the degrees to be published, and to lead a campaign against Masonry, creating many public notices stating the facts ascertained so far dealing with the Morgan affair, and asking for aid in any information regarding it. They arranged to meet again on July 4th. As the movement spread, more and more meetings were held and committees formed in the towns and villages and surrounding areas, all declaring their opposition to Freemasonry and its Brotherhood of Secrets. It was assumed that all good citizens would unite to vindicate the law. In Rochester, a committee of 7 was appointed. However, it turned out that 3 of the members were Masons, and it was later understood that these 3 went from the committee to the lodge rooms to share what was being found. Eventually, it was also discovered that these 3 men were not only sharing the information, but that they themselves had been involved in Morgan's disappearance. As the investigations proceeded, the evidence increased that Morgan had been illegally kept at the Canandaigua jail and then secretly taken to Fort Niagara, where he was kept hidden in a magazine. The joint committees, having been diligently tracing Morgan's journey from Canandaigua to Lewiston, released a report entitled Narrative of the Facts and Circumstances Related to the Kidnapping and Presumed Murder of William Morgan, also known as the Lewiston Report. There's a link to a free copy of that in the description box as well for all you curious cats. 38 individual investigators from 7 different counties concluded in their report that at least a dozen Masons were involved in the transportation of Morgan from the jail in Canandaigua to Fort Niagara, and at least a dozen more Masons either knew about the kidnapping, assisted in their travels, or knew that Morgan was being held at Fort Niagara without taking any action. It would seem that the kidnappers stopped for fresh horses several times, finding friendly sheriffs and jailers along the way. It was known that the conspirators passed through 5 separate counties: Ontario, Genesee, Niagara, Monroe, and Orleans, and the investigators had found evidence of a person being held against their will at Fort Niagara. This evidence being in the form of an ammunition box of human feces and heavy damage done to the inside of a door. In March of 1827, the Lewiston Committee again pleaded for assistance from the governor, DeWitt Clinton, who responded with yet another proclamation, this time with a reward up to $2,000 and a free pardon to anyone who, quote, as accomplice or cooperator shall make a full discovery of the offender or offenders, end quote. There was every reason to believe that Morgan was taken from the magazine and drowned in Lake Ontario. But this concept was boldly and persistently denied by many Masons. They insisted that Morgan was alive and well in Canada or another country, having been paid to leave town. Some say that he had staged the whole thing to gain publicity for his book. There were also those who actually defended Morgan's abduction, saying that he had forfeited his life by publishing secrets, since he had in fact swore on his life to keep those secrets. The investigation committees throughout the 7 counties involved encountered many obstacles in obtaining indictments that were needed, and in several instances were jeered and mocked at while attempting to find answers. It was these reactions of the other Masons that also helped convince the townspeople that this was not just a simple misdeed, but a widespread conspiracy. Finding all of this unjust and unchristian, the people resolved not to attend church or listen to any preacher who did not denounce Freemasonry as an evil institution. Correspondence committees were formed, and soon a statewide network of anti-Masonic operations came into being. The movement would become increasingly more political, and 5 months after Morgan's kidnapping, the Anti-Masonic Party was being born. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you would like to support this channel further, my Patreon and CashApp links are in the description box below. Stay tuned for part 4, or click on it now if it exists.